Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be covering a topic that seems to throw quite a lot of people, especially those who are fairly new to Toddle, and that is how do you pass data in and around your application. Now this assumes that you are building componentized apps, which I hope that you are, and we have several mechanisms that Toddle gives us for this to be able to achieve it. But what tends to throw people is, number one, how do we actually use each one? Okay, some are simple, some are not so simple, but then which do we use in different contexts, in different situations? So that's what I want to cover in this video. So if we take a look at this slide, we have built a very raw version of an application. So we've got our projects here, which has got formulas, and the reason I've put that in there because we've got project formulas that we need to cover. And then we've got the app page, and again the app page has variables, formulas, workflows, and then within the app page we've got component A, again variables, formulas, workflows, and component B is contained within component A. Now a component is a complete black box, which means that it's completely insulated from the outside world. So component A has absolutely no idea that it's sat on an app page. It could be sat in a different app page, it could be sat in a different component, it could be sat several layers deep, nested within a component tree. But in this case, it's sat directly on the app page. And the app page doesn't really know what component A does. It's got a general idea of what it does, but it doesn't know how it implements those details. And so because component A is insulated and the app page doesn't really know what's going on in component A, then they can't really share data between them. Okay, it doesn't. The variables that are here on the app page cannot be seen by component A, and with component B, it cannot see what's going on in the variables in component A. So in other words, there's no chain of data that we can just rely on. So obviously we have mechanisms to deal with that, e.g. attributes, context, project formulas. So what we can do then is we can say, well, in component A, I want to be able to receive some information that can be passed in from its container, and then I'll know what to do with that information. Okay, and that is a mechanism in Toddle that we call attributes, which is the most simple way that we can achieve this. So in other words, we can have an attribute on component A, okay, and then that can receive some data, and then we can pass that in from the app page, whether that's a variable on the app page or maybe it's something else, depends on how it's set up. But that is effectively it, is that we can pass data from the app page into component A via an attribute, and then we can pass data from component A into component B again via an attribute. So let's have a look at how that's going to work in Toddle. So this app, this project was built as part of the 2025 Toddle Beginner's Guide, which you can find on YouTube. It's nearly 9 hours long. It's a real long one if you want to dive in. A table of contents in there if you want to zoom in on different aspects. But anyway, I'm just continuing from that one. I did cover a lot of these concepts in that particular tutorial, but maybe not in the same way. So as and when you've got time, maybe you can go and have a look at that. But anyway, let's continue with this. So this is our main app page, and we have a variable called dark theme. If you don't see this when you're looking at yours, then obviously you can just click anywhere off the canvas or press escape, and then you'll see all of this. So we've got a variable called dark theme, okay? And then if you look on our tree, we've got some components. We've got a sidebar nav, which is this. Then we've got a header, which is this, and the content manager, which is our main area for content. So let's have a look at the sidebar nav. Now, presumably then, to style the sidebar nav, we're probably going to need to know whether the user is using dark theme or not. So we've got the variable, it's either true or false, whether it's true if it's a dark theme, false if it's a light theme. So we need to get that information into the sidebar nav somehow. So as we just covered, we'd use attributes for that. So what I'll do, I'll go into the sidebar nav component, and I'll set up an attribute here with clicking plus, and I'll call this dark theme. I'll set that to true as a test value. That is not an initial value or a default value, it is just test value that we can use while we're working in the editor. Okay, and then back in the page, now that's set up, we can now go to our sidebar nav, and now we get the attribute, and now I can simply point it at the dark theme variable. So that's what gets passed into the sidebar nav. So let's do that. Okay, dark theme, that's what it returns. And so now within the sidebar nav, we can do something to utilize that attribute to then change the theme as and when we want to do it. Now, again, the page doesn't know how we're going to do that. All it knows is we're going to pass the dark theme in and then let the component deal with it. Again, sort of separation of concerns. So let's go back to the page there. So that's fairly straightforward. So we can see that essentially that's what's happening. We've got a variable for dark theme, and then we're passing it in via an attribute into component A. Really, really simple, and the standard way of doing that to get data from its container into a component. So back in Toddle now, let's say we want to do the same thing with this content manager component here. We need to pass the dark or the dark theme variable to get the theming information into this component. So let's go into this. So we can do exactly the same thing. We can add an attribute. So come here, click to create an attribute, and let's call this dark theme as well. Again, a test value of true. Okay, that's fine. Does exactly the same thing as what we did with the sidebar navigation component. However, if we look down here, we've now got nested components. So we've got components for dashboard and all these other things as well. I won't go into that, but let's say now we need to then pass in that dark theme into our dashboard component. So we can do that. We can go in here and we can do exactly the same thing, add an attribute, and we can say that we want the dark theme. Sorry, that's the test value. My apologies. The name is dark theme. I was doing so well with my typing. There we go. So now essentially what's going on there, if we go back to the content manager, is we can now pass the dark theme. If we just go into our dashboard, we can now pass this into the dashboard component. Again, we can just grab it from the dark theme that was passed in from the page. So what we're essentially doing there is getting this variable, passing it through an attribute into component A, and then we're passing that value then as an attribute down into component B. Okay, passing it down 2 levels of components. Now that's fine. However, what if we've got a component C? What if we've got a component D, E, F, and G, and so on and so forth, which you will find as you build out even any reasonably complex app, you're starting to build up quite a nested component tree in your application. That's going to become very, very cumbersome pretty quick, okay, because then you're having to pass it down all the way, all down these levels, and it's going to take up a lot of mental bandwidth to work out exactly what's going on there as well. And if we look back in Toddle, we can see that we're going to have to pass that into all of these. So we're going to have to pass that dark theme into all of these. Each one of these is going to have that dark theme attribute, and then anything that's nested within that needs to be going to have that dark theme. So you can imagine we're going to go all down these different levels of components, passing that attribute all the way through. And so what ideally we'd like really is to have a way that we can have the variable, the dark theme variable, for example, on our page, and that component A and component B, rather than pass it down as attributes, is actually get access to that variable, no matter where we are in our application, because the dark theme, any component throughout the app, buttons, everything will need to be taken into account that theme. So we're going to need access for it everywhere. So it'd be great if we could just have that variable available everywhere, and then component A and component B and C and D and E, etc. can just pick that up wherever it wants. And fortunately, Toddle has a mechanism, a concept explicitly to deal with this, and that is context. So effectively then, what we can do is to pass the information from our page into our component A and also our component B, because that has access to it, and also all the way down to C, D, E, F, G, however many layers that go on as well. We can also have variables that are exposed in context, let's say in component A, that component B can get hold of as well. But in this case, we're just sticking with the app page. Now notice from the previous slide, I moved the arrows from the variables to the formulas, because we can't actually expose the variables natively further down the tree. What we can do is expose formulas and workflows, and in the formulas we can then return the value of the variable. Okay, so then that means that we can expose the dark theme variable through a formula that's exposed in context, and then component A, component B, and so on and so forth can then grab those. Okay, so let's have a look at how we can do that. So back in our page then, is what we can do is to, here we've already got, under formulas, we've already got a dark theme formula, and it's exposed as context, and we can tell that because it's got the two intermingled rings there as well. So let's have a look at that. Now we can see on the left it's exposed in context, which says access this context in child components. Okay, and that's exactly what we're doing, and this one is returning the value of the dark theme variable. So that means that now, via context, we now have access to the value that's held in the dark theme variable anywhere in our application. So we come to our concept manager that we're just dealing with, okay, and we come all the way down into the dashboard. We come to context here. What we can do is we can add a context, and we can say that we want to get access to the dark theme, and because we exposed it as context on the page, we now can subscribe to that. So now we can just tick to subscribe to it, and now we have access to that dark theme value, so that we can now theme this component without having to pass it down through a dark theme attribute. In fact, we can get rid of that now because we're using it. Okay, and then if we go to the previous level, we can go to the concept manager. We can do the same thing in here as well. In fact, I think I've already done it. I have. So we've already got the dark theme. Subscribe to the dark theme. So now that's available, so I can utilize that in the component, and I can then get rid of the dark theme attribute. Okay. And if we go back here to the app. So now if we want to expose any variable, let's say the current user, because usually we need access to the user throughout our application, then we simply can expose it through a formula, and then it's available everywhere through our application. So it's not a global variable as such. It's effectively just exposing data throughout the tree so that everybody can use it, every subcomponent can use it. As it is important to remember that we're talking about data flowing down the tree to its child components. So because we're on the page, then everything is a child of the page, so therefore everything has access to anything that we expose in context on the page. If we exposed a context formula, let's say on the header, okay, we couldn't then access that in the concept manager because they're not flowing downwards. That's on the same level. So in other words, the context flows the data down the tree, not up the tree or across the tree, purely cascades it down the component tree. So now let's look at project formulas, because a project formula, as we can see here, is a formula that is available globally throughout our application. And because of that, sometimes people get mixed up with, they can use it as some kind of global variable, and that's not strictly true. Okay, because if you look at the app page and the components, we have variables, formulas, workflows. In the project, we only have formulas. Okay, we don't have variables. You can't store variable data on the project. So there's global formulas, but there's no global variables that you can have in your projects. Okay, so let's have a look at what project formulas are. So I come here into files and I go down and I take a look at formulas. So I've got one called empty. Now, this is a great example of just some logic that you may want to be available everywhere in your application. That's just fairly simple, that is just common logic, and all I'm doing in here is just testing for an empty value, whether it's null or there's no data inside of a string. For example, I've got an argument where I pass a value in so that it can test it. And that is actually key to project formulas, and when you should use them and the limitations of them is that project formulas have no access to external data. So we look at the page. Okay, we have variables on the page, but the project formula doesn't have access to those variables. We could have multiple pages in our project, so it doesn't know which page is loaded at any one time. So therefore it has no access to external data. The only data that a formula has access to is what is passed in. Sorry, I opened the wrong one there. That is passed in as an argument, and then it can utilize that. So that means that when you're calling a project formula from, let's say, within a component or within a page, the data has to be passed in via an argument, and you need to know that data at that point. So it can't be used to get at, let's say, the dark theme, because the dark theme is a value that is held on a page, and as I say, it doesn't have access to external data, and therefore you to run it, trying to get at the value of the dark theme, it doesn't have access to it. It only got access to data that you pass in. Well, you don't have the data to pass in, so it wouldn't work in that case. So that's not something that we could use to get at the dark theme in that case. We would use context for that. And the other reason to use formulas, that, by the way, where you want held logic globally, that's the main reason to use project formulas. There are some limitations. For example, if you build a library of project formulas, they can't call each other. Okay, that's a limitation. That's something that I found out with by painful trial and error, is that building, say, several different project formulas and trying to call one from the other doesn't work. But the other way is to have it store static data. So in other words, rather than hold this array, which is for options on our sidebar menu in here, that's what they use for the options on in the navigator. Rather than store that on a variable on the page, I store it as a project formula, and then I can get at that everywhere in the application. But it has to be static data. It can't be dynamic, because again, the project cannot store variables globally at the project level. There's no data available at this point, so I'm just creating this as static data that I can then call from elsewhere in my app without having to use either context or attributes. Okay, so if it's constant or static data, then that is another good use of project formula. Okay, so with all that said, then when do we use each one? When is the best time and the best circumstance to use each one? And so let's go through some rules of thumb or best practices that I like to use. So let's have a look at attributes first. So the two circumstances in which I would always use attributes are either when data is required to be passed into a component but does not need to be passed deeper down the component tree. We saw that before with our sidebar nav, is that it just needs to have the dark theme passed down into one level. It's not going to got any nested components, so that's fine to use as an attribute. Okay. The other circumstance is when you don't want a component to have a dependency on a specific project. For example, you want to share it across projects or with other toddle devs. So obviously if you're building, let's say, a widget like a special button that's got some special styling and some nice effects on it, whatever it may be, and you want to use that across multiple projects, and maybe you want to share that with other people, then you can't have that with a dependency on a specific project. So we've been through context and the fact that you can pass data down from the page all the way down. The downside to that is that you're creating a dependency on that specific project. And obviously you can copy that component and use it elsewhere and just tweak it so that it's not a problem. But particularly if you want to make it very generic, let's say you want to put it in a package and share it with other toddle developers, then obviously you wouldn't use context. You would always use attributes in that case to make sure there's no dependency on the project. So those are the two key circumstances when you would use an attribute. So let's have a look at context. So you'd use context when data needs to be available through multiple levels of nested components, not just a single level. So we looked at that earlier on, where if we just go back to here, we can see that what we want to do is to pass data that's on the page all the way down to component B, or maybe C, D, E, F, G, whatever, all the way down a component tree, rather than just a single level of passing it into one level of component D. And the other way that you would use context is when data is required to be passed into a single level of component, but is already exposed through context. Now, okay, let's go and take a look at this. So let's go back to the page. Now, at the moment, we've exposed our dark theme variable through a context formula, but we're passing it in to the sidebar nav as an attribute. Now, that's fine, But the trouble is that we're getting at that dark theme through other components, through context. So I wouldn't advise or recommend that you have two methods of passing the dark theme around. Just have one method, which is through context. Now, obviously, if I wanted to reuse this sidebar in other projects, or we've already been through this, or share it with other people, I wouldn't use context because I don't want to create that dependency. But in this case, this is unique to this project, so I'm passing the dark theme around using context, so I don't really want to do it here. So that follows the rule that we just said, is that when data is required passed to a single level, but it's already exposed through context. So therefore what I can do is in this sidebar nav is I'm going to actually get rid of that, the attribute, and instead I'm going to create the context, which I've already done. I've already subscribed to the dark theme, and I'm going to use that instead. Okay. Now obviously if I wasn't exposing that variable in the app through context, and the sidebar is one level deep that I need to pass a value in, then I just use an attribute exactly as I did a moment ago. And finally, we got project formulas. So the reason that you'd use those is when you need global access to static data in a project. So we've just shown that with the options array, where we've got a list of options that's never going to change at runtime. So it has to be constant, a constant value. It can't be a variable value. It has to be static. And then that's a really good way, that's a really good scenario to use project formulas. And when you need access to logic globally in a project that requires no arguments, or arguments that are known by the components referencing that. So we've already covered that. Our formulas here where we've got the empty, so we want to access this logic globally throughout the project. Okay, but remember, like I said, project formulas don't have access to any external data other than what you pass in as arguments. So at the point of running this, wherever it may be, I need to know the value that I need to pass in as the arguments that this formula requires. Okay, so either the formula doesn't have any arguments, or it's called where the argument is known. Again, the example that I gave was to do with, some people will try and do this, try and shoehorn, trying to get this dark theme everywhere in their app through a project formula. It's never going to work because the project has no access to data. So project formulas has no access to external data, including APIs, by the way, at that level. So at the point of running a project formula, we have to have access to the data via an argument. We need to be able to pass it in. So we need to know it in the first place. And the whole point of doing this here is that we need to know, we're trying to get what the dark theme is. So the project formula is just not going to work. In that case, the context is always the best for that scenario. So what we've covered in this video is really to do with passing data into components and getting data around the application that we need, and also sharing logic globally. Okay, we've not really covered how you get data out of a component, or how we can get, or how we can update a variable, let's say the dark theme, from another component, especially a nested component. Okay, so maybe that's a subject for another video, but I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope it's useful. If context and attributes and project formulas were throwing you previously, I hope that's really helped you. Don't forget to like and subscribe with this video. It really helps. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.